4:12 hours, Normandy. Dew hangs on canvas. A generator catches its breath and steadies. In a canvas shelter, a headset hums against a radar operator's ear while his pencil floats over the glass. Out beyond the hedge, a German battery does what yesterday always rewarded. 10 quick rounds from positions tucked neatly into green walls and dark lanes. They expect the old pause, those long seconds when the enemy must see or hear and then guess. On the scope, a shy fleck moves, then another. The operator marks, not because the dots are dramatic, but because they are honest. He passes a grid to the fire direction center without ceremony. In the sandbagged room down the field, men who've slept in numbers more than beds slide rulers, check the morning's wind chart, and speak a language of short confirmations. Batteries swing, breaches clack, and the clock that matters is no longer the one on a wrist, but the one built into a practiced sequence. The German captain readies his displacement drill and waits for silence, the kind that used to cushion a battery before counter-battery lumbered awake. Instead, the American reply arrives like a verdict already signed. A loader reaches for a shell and finds air. A phone line jerks loose. A carefully folded plan starts to fray. The hedgerow hides guns from eyes, but it cannot hide the path of a shell from a device that notices arcs rather than camouflage. The operator doesn't need to see pits or men. He reads their existence in the curve of flight, samples it a handful of times, then lets geometry point backward to the place where the round began. The fire direction center turns that place into angles and charges, preferring speed that is good enough to perfection that is late. First impacts rake the pits. A follow-up beats along the exit lane where prime movers must hesitate. What used to be minutes has collapsed into a breath. Someone tries a decoy, a field away, a single mouth of flame meant to mislead. The scope notes the odd arc. The center weighs value against time, and the main mission holds. The work remains unromantic. Terse voices, penciled corrections, the discipline to stop when the line goes quiet rather than spend ammunition on pride. When it ends, the field keeps its secrets, but the hedge no longer keeps the battery. Later there will be stories, luck, spies, magic. The crew in the shelter will remember only seconds. They listened to the shells, and the shells told them where they were born. The triumph was not a miracle machine, but a chain that refused to waste time. A sense that writes, a room that decides, wires that behave, and guns that speak on cue. Another faint fleck appears. The pencil lifts. Track acquired. War looks chaotic until you learn to watch how it draws. Every shell thrown into the sky follows a shape so reliable that a few marks on a screen, taken a heartbeat apart, can be rewound to the spot where the gun stood. The radar does not care for paint or branches or nets. It cares for where an object is, which direction it's heading, and how that changes with time. Give a competent crew 2 or 3 glimpses and they can turn motion into an origin. They do not need to see the barrel. The flight writes the return address. Reality argues, of course. The air bends radio in strange weather. Trees answer back and pretend to be shells. Cold propellant and tired barrels shift how far and how fast rounds travel. Hands shake when mortars are too near and coffee too far. The craft lives in shrinking those interferences until the remaining uncertainty still fits inside an enemy lane. Crews check their clocks so distance won't lie. They choose sites on small rises so the beam clears near ground. They study the day's air so bent signals can be unbent in the mind. They rehearse until a mark is not a guess, but a habit, anchoring a second habit that follows. Speed matters more than polish. A solution that is close enough, quickly, hurts a battery that planned to vanish in a minute. A perfect solution that arrives after the limbers move is a handsome failure. The center's art lives in that trade. Fire now on a solid estimate, or hold a breath to coordinate a trap where several guns speak at once, and the impacts meet like a door slamming. The choice is not theatrical, it is practical. Every second spent choosing is a second the other man uses to leave. What radar overturns is the timeline inherited from the last war. Old methods began at the gun itself, waiting for flash or sound to reach enough places for triangles to intersect. Those methods punished crews who lingered. They rewarded brief missions and quick jumps. Radar begins with the first round already in flight. The clock starts earlier, and the habits built to exploit later clocks begin to fail. Short missions no longer guarantee safety. Splitting sections no longer confuses the reply for long. Nets and nets of camouflage become a private comfort. The system that makes this possible is larger than any scope. Surveyors tie friendly guns to the map so that a good plot does not die in translation. Weathermen chase the day's mischief so range stays honest after sunrise. Observers add what glass can still add: bearings, negatives, context when a hedge hides everything except the truth of movement. The net stays disciplined so numbers don't drown in adjectives. When the shell speaks again, the conversation continues without fuss. In this world, measuring fast is not a party trick. It is the permission to decide before the window closes. The enemy's round, for a few seconds, cannot lie about where it came from. If you can catch those seconds, you can make your own. War taught people to listen long before it taught them to calculate. In the last war, men turned the front into a nervous system, microphones buried like seeds, cables strung like veins, observers hunched over notebooks waiting for the sky to pinch and flash. Flash and sound ranging were not romantic, they were patient. They made geometry out of thunder. Picture it, a crescent of listening posts, each with a clock disciplined by routine and bullying, because time is easier to keep when someone's career depends on it. A German battery fires. The tongue of flame betrays a bearing to one observer, and a few seconds later the wave of sound slaps each microphone in turn. Time differences are not poetry, they're triangles. Draw enough of them, and the origin appears where they cross. That was the trick that scared men in 1916. Guns that thought they were ghosts discovered that the air remembers every shout and tells anyone with a ruler. But sound needs time. It crawls. And flash needs eyes, and eyes need clear lines and honest horizons. So the defense against that old geometry was mobility and weather and cleverness. Fire short, mask with fog or night, split your sections, never grow roots. If the enemy needs a minute to hear and compute, survive by living in seconds. Between the wars, the books grew thicker. Surveyors got better, observers learned not to blink, cables learned to resist damp. The system improved, but it remained a system of natural senses. The battlefield was a place that spoke in light and noise, and men tried to trap that speech in math. Electrons changed the etiquette. Radar began as a polite question asked of the sky. Is there anything out there to hit our ships? It wasn't about guns on the ground. It was about airplanes and the sea's habit of being too big for binoculars. Scientists built apparatus that sent pulses into the dark and waited to be insulted by their own echoes. Something solid would reflect the rudeness back, and the set would mark the return like a diary entry. Once that worked, it was obvious what might come next, not to everyone, but to enough stubborn people. If an airplane could be seen in radio, what else could be? Mortars, for one fat arcs at modest speeds, lofted high, easy to catch if you knew where to stare. Early field crews discovered that under the right conditions, the sky wrote with mortar ink. A curious lieutenant asked whether faster, sleeker handwriting artillery shells could be read too. The textbooks were unhelpful. The war was not. Crews dragged sets into fields, bent antenna patterns, tuned gain until the scope stopped coughing and started whispering. They learned the language by ear. When clutter sounded like rain on a tin roof, when a rocket's plume confided its course position, when a 10.5 centimeters shell sketched a line too thin to love, but thick enough to plot. This wasn't a top-down miracle, it was a bottom-up argument with physics. The sets were built for something else. The operators asked them to commit small crimes. Antenna lobe shapes were wrong for low-angle ground tracking. Then shift the sighting, raise the mast, rotate the world, until the lobe kissed the zone where arcs lived. Displays were meant for dots big as aircraft. Then change the expectations, not the dots. A green line that flickered like a nervous moth could be tamed by routine. Mark, breathe, mark again, entertain doubt. Then call the FDC when doubt shrank enough to fit inside a grid square. The old network, flash, sound, eyes didn't vanish. It learned to live with a new sense. On good days, radar led. The first to speak, feeding an origin to the plotting board before the ears finished their sentence. On bad days, when weather bent returns or trees sang too loudly, the old senses anchored the picture and told the scope when it was lying. Integration didn't mean a wedding. It meant a truce between organs, each with a job, none with a crown. The culture had to adjust. The best flash-ranging NCOs had habits you couldn't buy. Patience drawn tight as wire, a suspicion of anything too easy, the confidence to mark a bearing and let the math hunt. Radar crews needed the same spine. The machine could not replace the personality. It needed a particular kind, the kind that believes in rehearsal more than reputation. The first units to make electrons lethal weren't the ones with the fanciest kit. They were the ones that treated debugging as doctrine. Wire discipline mattered more than ever. Electrons help you detect fast, then punish you if you can't decide fast. A battalion could have the prettiest plots and still miss the window if the net sounded like a bar fight. So the radio voice learned to be austere. Call signs, grids, shot, splash, repeat. Encouragement after the mission, jokes after chow. During the solve, numbers and time. The Germans, for their part, noticed symptoms before they understood causes. Diaries and interrogations tell the same story in different accents. We fired 2 salvos and the American counter-battery was immediate. Not quick, not soon, immediate. Men used to living under the curve of a minute found themselves in the sharp corner of a handful of seconds. Even when radar wasn't the factor, radar's existence warped behavior. Crews displaced sooner, shortened missions to the point of anemia, and bled effects across a front that needed concentrated fire. The fear of being caught became, itself, a weapon against the effectiveness of their guns. This is how new senses win. Not by omniscience, by tempo, by forcing the enemy to respect the possibility of instant reply and to deform his doctrine around that dread. Flash and sound had been a grim gravity. Radar was a cliff edge. The old system said, move before they finish the math. The new system said, they've already started. And once an army starts living by that clock training survey at midnight because it buys seconds at dawn, rehearsing wire drills until the tongue can recite a grid in its sleep, letting the Met section veto bravado because refracted returns are expensive, then electrons become more than sparks. They become a habit. Habits survive weather, survive staff rotation, survive the fog. They build a battlefield where the sky's curve is a sentence, and the unit is literate enough to read it out loud and answer in steel. On paper, the field sets weren't built to read shells. Their creators imagined aircraft like cathedral spires drifting into range, or mortar arcs that obligingly shouted their presence. Shells are rude. They are small, fast, selfish with reflection. No sensible engineer signs off on detect 75 millimeters at low elevation in clutter from a tent. Yet crews did it often enough to matter, often enough to teach doctrine to respect improvisation. Start with the hardware that arrived in crates, a generator with opinions, a display that preferred clean dots to nervous threads, an antenna whose lobe pattern looked like a lantern beam when what you needed was a scalpel. The manual told you how to sight for aircraft or mortars. It did not advise you on the twitch of a 10.5 centimeters shell at 7 degrees above the horizon, while a hedgerow shouted at you in leaves. So crews rewrote the manual with thumbprints. They sighted sets where the lobe kissed the suspected enemy gun lanes, not where a staff map said was convenient, but where ground swell and tree line made the beam useful. They learned to hate certain fields because the dirt itself sang back. They raised masts a meter higher than the book liked, and learned which guy lines to curse when the wind behaved like artillery. They tuned gain down when the world got loud, up when the sky went empty, and marked not every flicker but every consistent flicker. Consistency breeds confidence. Confidence buys fire missions. Displays were not delicate, the men were. Under stress, Humans invent patterns in noise and miss patterns in signal. The best operators had a habit of skepticism and a ritual of confirmation. First, mark, then wait a heartbeat, for a second return along a plausible curve, then mark again. If the second mark escaped the gravity of the first, erase and regret nothing. If it fell where ballistics whispered it should, call the plot. They carried grease pencils like talismans and erased more than they announced. The enemy owes their survival to those erasures. Our side owes theirs to the announcements. Plotting boards, ostensibly a stopgap, became instruments of speed. Triangles, rulers, protractors, nothing romantic, everything rehearsed. An operator's plot landed in the FDC on paper, already stained by pre-dawn survey. This is the part outsiders miss, the pre in preparation. The night before, the survey section had sweated bearings and distances like a monastery, making illuminated manuscripts every digit exact. Not because precision flatters the soul, but because a bad datum at noon kills a friend at dawn. The FDC cached firing solutions for likely enemy lanes, as if prepping a kitchen. Mise en place for murder. The radar plot wasn't a surprise. It was a confirmation. Plug, tweak, command, fire. Limitations forced craft. In rain, returns bloomed like algae. In snow, the world became a soft lyre. Tree lines at certain ranges imitated shell arcs with malice. Low ground ate trajectories. The answer wasn't, radar is useless today. The answer was, what kind of useful is it today? Crews graded themselves. A. Confidence track. B. Confidence in clutter. Confidence suspect cross-check with sound, ranging before committing a battery. That vocabulary kept the system honest. Pride kills. Graded humility kills the enemy. The sets also taught the units to respect placement as a weapon. A radar too far back looks over the wrong terrain and misses low-angle tracks. Too far forward and a single lucky fragment retires an entire sense. Good commanders learned the art of the middle. Forward enough to see, back enough to live, wired deep into redundancy so that a cut line meant a reroute, not silence. They learned to sight with the map and confirm with the feet. Staff work is ink, reality is mud. Integration with other sensors happened by necessity, then by design. When a flash post reported a bearing within seconds of a radar plot, confidence rose like a tide. When sound ranging triangulated to a similar grid, the FDC's hand grew heavier on the battery switch. Gunners learned to trust the chorus over any soloist. The set could be wrong, the air could be malicious, the men could be tired. 3 imperfect senses singing the same melody were better than one virtuoso drunk on his own tone. German countermeasures evolved, and so did the set's tactics. Decoy flashes? Radar doesn't listen to lies made of light. It listens to mass in motion. Split. Battery fires. Fine, 2 origin solutions instead of 1, 2 missions queued. Ammunition expenditure weighed against target value. Rapid displacement. Effective if the displacement happens before the first track becomes a grid. If not, the move is a flight into plotted steel. The sobering truth for the enemy was this. The shell speaks faster than the limber rolls. Above all, the field learned a cruel kindness. Perfection is a luxury, but tempo is a right. An 80-meter origin error solved in 20 seconds beats a 30-meter origin solved in 90 when the enemy plans to quit the lane by 75. The FDC trained itself to know where that threshold lived, to order a mission now with standard fuse and charge, or to hold for 5 seconds to convert to time on target across 2 batteries. That judgment is not in any radar, it's in people who have rehearsed, to the point where judgment arrives as quickly as reflex. By war's midpoint, the phrase "shouldn't have worked" felt childish to the crews. Of course it worked often. Not always, because worked didn't mean superhero vision. It meant shaving seconds. It meant turning the unknowable into the probably enough. It meant forcing the other man to live inside your clock, not his. Machines made it possible. Habits made it real. The sets were not marvels. They were arguments with physics conducted by men who carried toolkits in their heads. The toolkits included wrenches and trig, grease pencils and shame, coffee and contempt for drama. Out of that came a battlefield where an invisible line on a circular screen could rearrange enemy routines, humble doctrinal pride, and, on grey mornings in hedgerow country, make a battery vanish before it understood that the sky had learned to listen. If the radar is a new sense, the Fire Direction Center is the brain that refuses to panic. The FO, the forward observer, gives the brain eyes. None of them win alone. Together, they make time elastic. Picture the network at 3:50, before the day notices itself. In a slit trench overlooking a lane where German guns might be, an FO watches darkness with a map folded to the contour lines that matter. He isn't hunting glory. He's hunting repeatable landmarks. He has pre-registered points, PRPs, dotting likely gun lanes and road cuts, each a label in grease pencil. A3, B1, C4. He knows the distances and deflections from the friendly battery to each dot. He knows the signal plan and which words the net accepts and which it refuses. He knows, crucially, that if the radar calls a grid first, his job is not to argue but to anchor. Back at the FDC, coffee is a superstition, and pencils are knives. The chief of FDC lives in numbers. Range to fuse tables, charge settings, drift corrections, map scales in the bones of his hand. The night's survey crew gave him a gift, the battery's position tied into the grid so tightly that a tape measure would blush. The Met section gave him another, a wind and temperature profile that turns guesswork into adjustment. On a wallboard, someone wrote the sector's likely counter-battery zones. Beneath each, pre-computed firing data with columns that feel like a ritual deflection. Quadrant, charge, fuse, remarks. The radar shack doesn't make speeches. It calls in a voice that could be a weather report. Counter, battery plot. Grid 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Confidence, Bravo. Suspected elevation, 120 meters. That last part matters. Firing at a man on a hill is not the same as firing at a man in a ditch. The FDC operator circles the pre-computed solution for that zone, adjusts with the delta between assumed and reported elevation, and checks the wind line. The chief murmurs, "Confirm," and the talker pushes it to the gun line. Seconds, not minutes. If the FO has eyes on the suspected lane, he adds a bearing from OP260, muzzle flash intermittent, sound lag 2.1. He isn't competing with radar, he's giving the FDC a second hand on the same clock. If he has no view, he says the most valuable word on a disciplined net. Negative. Silence beats speculation. Speculation costs shells. Wire discipline is the software that makes hardware truthful. The battalion net accepts short canonical phrases. Shot, splash -5. Repeat, end of mission, no editorial. The counter battery net adds a few. Track, plot to follow. Confidence Alpha divided by Bravo divided by Charlie. Decoy suspected. When someone drifts into adjectives, the chief of FDC will correct him after, never during. During, the network is an instrument. You don't play jazz on a metronome. Now, the choreography. The FDC calls a mission on Battery A because A's lay and sector are right for the first solution. He also warns Battery B to prepare TOT on the second grid if a split battery German fire appears, because radar often sees more than one origin when the enemy tries to be clever. While A lays, the FDC sends fuse settings based on the enemy's likely overhead cover deep pits. Use delayed action and aim for the parapet to cave it in. Shallow, hasty positions. Quick fuse for airburst to maul men and shatter optics. The FO, if he can, calls observe and prepares to adjust. If he cannot, the radar's update on the second shell track refines the origin enough to skip adjustment altogether. First volley lands where adjustments used to end. The wires are redundant not because engineers love redundancy, but because a cut wire is a dead sentence. Primary lines run forward, alternate lines curve around predictable breakpoints, and a radio net sits behind them as a final layer. Line crews memorize the routes like smugglers memorize safe houses. When a line goes dead under shelling, a corporal is already moving with a spool and a prayer. The battalion's tempo does not collapse because it refuses to trust a single path. Pre-computation is the quiet hero. The night shift mapped the enemy side of the world gun lanes, likely battery hide sites, tractor ruts, field gates, and assigned each a number. For each number they computed a solution. The FDC's draws are not tidy because the chief is neat. They are tidy because a second saved in a drawer buys a life at a pit. Mise en place. A gunner jokes when he lines up shells and fuse keys. The joke is true. War's kitchen opens early. The integration shines when the enemy tries to be smart. A German section pops a short mission, then slides left 200 meters to avoid reply. Radar sees the arc of the first salvo and the second. FO's bearing shifts 2 degrees. The FDC doesn't treat this as confusion, it treats it as a dataset. The chief orders a split counter battery. First volley on the initial grid to catch the ammo stack and command post. Second volley on the shifted grid with a 15-second offset to meet the guns as they arrive at their safe lane. Safety is a schedule. The FDC breaks the schedule. The FO's closing report is terse. Enemy fire diminished, smoke, movement ceased. The radar adds, no further tracks. The FDC, end of mission. In a logbook, someone will later write the probability of kill estimate and the ammunition expenditure. That math feeds tomorrow's choices: how many rounds to keep reserved for counter battery, how many to dedicate to planned fires, whether to set aside a tot package for dawn when enemy routines are laziest. What makes this a weapon is not a miracle sensor. It's the refusal to treat any sensor as a soloist. Radar marks, FO confirms, or denies. Survey anchors, MET corrects. FDC decides. Guns execute. Wire keeps the conversation honest. The enemy lives in seconds. The integration steals those seconds, shaves them to nothing, and spends them as steel. In that network, heroism is reliability. The most dangerous man is the one whose grid is always right and whose voice is always short. Assumptions are doctrine with a better tailor. The German artillery arm entered this war with honest lessons from the last. Mask the gun, move fast after firing, keep missions short, split batteries to dilute risk, and trust camouflage as a religion. Against flash and sound, those habits were sensible. Against radar, they were rituals to an absent god. Start with camouflage, the netting, the brush, the cunning of blending pits into hedges. Against eyes, it's superb. Against ears, it helps a little by encouraging dispersed sighting and interrupting line of sight for flash. Against radar that listens to shells mid-flight, camouflage is theatre performed for a blind audience. The shell leaves the net and writes its confession in the air. No amount of burlap clips that sentence. Shoot and scoot was doctrine's counter to the slow math of the last war. Fire 2 or 3 salvos. Limber. Reposition before the enemy's triangulation wakes up. It worked then because the enemy's solve began with your sound. Radar moves the starting pistol. The solve begins with the first shell's arc. If you can limber and move a battery within 60 to 90 seconds, congratulations, you are a fantasy, and your horses or trucks don't exist in mud. Real crews need minutes. Radar makes minutes expensive. Short missions fire 5 rounds, call it a day, also bent under the new clock. Short missions were designed to deny the enemy enough samples, to compute. But samples now arrive in the sky within seconds, not off the ground in long, slow waves. The first sample may be enough for a coarse grid. The second tightens it. The third seals it. A mission cut short can still be long enough to die. Split battery tactics, intended to dilute the enemy's reply, created 2 origin solutions instead of 1. Good FDCs welcomed that. They queued 2 missions, weighted by target value, guns first, command posts second, and decided whether to hit simultaneously, 2 batteries firing, or sequentially with time on target math. The only time splitting helped was when the terrain created radar shadows, deep folds where low-angle arcs disappeared. But those same folds often constrained German sighting options and telegraphed likely lanes. Radar's weaknesses were predictable. The FDC pre-wrote answers for them. Displacement drills well practiced by German crews assumed the enemy's reply would be both delayed and centrally aimed. When counter-battery fell during displacement, doctrine buckled. Crews tried to short-circuit drills, skipping checks, abandoning some rounds in pits to buy time, neglecting camouflage at the next site. Each saboteur of procedure made the next mission sloppier. Radar didn't just kill tubes. It degraded craft. The quality curve bent downward with each immediate reply because fear hates nuance. Another assumption, that counter-battery would fixate on guns alone. Radar, backed by experienced FDCs and observers, learned to target what made guns work: ammo stacks, phone lines, prime movers, the commander's trench. Destroy a tube and you lower volume. Destroy fuel and you paralyze. Destroy the switchboard and you blind. Once origin grids were trustworthy and quick, FDCs had the luxury of choosing which piece of the battery's anatomy to shatter first. German doctrine expected a punch to the jaw. It got nerve strikes. The German belief in decoys, flash simulators, false pits, powder, bursts helped against human eyes and flash-ranging notebooks. Radar is rude. It pays no attention to an empty pit unless a shell is actually in the air. Crews that invested time in the theatre of false mouths found that the critic they meant to fool hadn't bought a ticket. Mobility remained a real countermeasure, but only if reconceived. The units that adapted best treated mobility as preemption, not reaction, changing firing positions before dawn on a schedule, sitting for single salvo snaps at odd angles, rehearsing routes that threaded radar shadows, and timing missions to overlap friendly counter-battery or air activity that might mask their signatures. Those adaptations bought minutes. Minutes are life. But they were expensive in throughput, in fatigue, in ammunition logistics. A gun line that moves before it's empty creates supply puzzles that today's trucks and horses can't always solve. The greatest broken assumption wasn't tactical, it was moral. German gun crews believed their craft gave them leverage over the battlefield: accuracy, discipline, swift execution. They weren't wrong. Radar didn't outcraft them. It redefined what swift meant. Pride that once belonged to, "We can get 4 rounds downrange in 60 seconds, had to face a new math. They can be on us by 75. Excellence became anxiety. Anxiety steals seconds. Lost seconds invite steal. You can see adaptation in diaries, more mention of single rounds as harassment instead of planned fires, complaints about being ordered to conserve ammunition because displacement consumed too much, notes about moving into woods despite the risk of tree bursts because open fields felt like stages with spotlights. A doctrine that prioritizes survival over effect is already losing. Radar made that choice rational and tragic. None of this says German artillery became incompetent. It says their competence was trapped in a clock built for an older enemy. To survive, they needed a new timepiece, pre-planned deception that targeted process, cutting wire grids, heavier use of silent batteries that changed positions nightly, and integration with their own counter-battery to punish American radar sites when they dared push forward. Some tried, many couldn't. The war's logistics leaned against them. Fuel, tires, spares, fresh horses, replacement tubes, radar punished a force already living on thin margins. Assumptions break loudly, but the thing that breaks them is often quiet. A sweep on a circular scope, a pencil line on a plotting board, a voice on a net saying only numbers. It turns out the most dangerous argument on a battlefield isn't shouted. It's timed. There's romance in language like, kill chain, throw it away. What follows is a stopwatch strapped to process. 90 seconds is not a slogan, it's a budget. Second 04. Origin begins. A German tube barks. The shell lifts into air that doesn't care for uniforms. The radar's transmitter has pulsed and is listening. No one has yet said a word. Most of what matters is already set. The radar is sighted where arcs live, The FDC's drawers hold pre-computed data. The FO knows what negative means and when to say it. Second 512. First return, first mark. On the scope, the return is faint, almost ashamed. The operator marks. He doesn't fall in love. He knows Clutter tries to flirt. He waits for the second return along the plausible curve. The talker preps the net with track plot to follow. This is not a promise. It's a courtesy that primes the FDC to widen attention. Second 13:20. Second mark, course fit. The operator marks again. Now you have 2 points and a time difference. The plotting corporal sketches a line that gravity will bend. He back-solves to an origin candidate. The talker pushes the first grid with a confidence code. The FDC doesn't pause to admire. It cross-checks with its prepared zone list. If the grid aligns with a likely lane, the chief calls Battery A to lay on. Battery A, counter battery, grid 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 to 8. Charge 5. Fuse quick, confirm. Second 21:35. Third mark, refine or confirm. A third point lands. If the curve hugs the prediction, confidence rises. If it strays, the plotting corporal adjusts and calls update grid. The FO, if he has line of sight, sends a bearing or a negative. The chief chooses to keep the mission moving or to swap to battery B if B's lay reduces time to shot. This is an optimization problem the FDC solves by habit. Which battery can meet the window with adequate effect? Second 30, 6, 50. Guns prepare to speak. At the pits, gunners aren't waiting for literature. They're setting deflection and quadrant, loading propellant, setting fuse per order. The section chief reads the fire order back, garbage in kills friends, and the gunner calls ready. If the FDC intends a TOT, it sequences the fire order so that rounds from multiple tubes meet in time, not just space. TOT is a traffic problem in the sky. The FDC is a ruthless cop. Second 50, 160. Shot. The word shot is a promise. It means the clock is now running on 2 arcs, the enemy's and yours. The FDC notes the time and calls splash -5 when appropriate. The FO prepares to observe not for theatrical reasons, but to decide whether a repeat buys more than it costs. The radar keeps listening. If the enemy's second or third shell lifts, the origin refinement continues. Mid-mission improvement is allowed if it doesn't slow steel. Second 6175. Splash. The first US rounds arrive. If the mission was on a single battery, the effect is a hammer. If it was a TOT, the effect is a trapdoor. The FDC listens for the FO's words and for the radar's silence. If the radar reports no further tracks, that's a different story than continuing tracks with drift left. The FO's left 100, add 50 is either the next step or unnecessary because the first solution erased the problem. Second 7690. Decide to end or to harvest. The FDC chooses repeat, fuse delay. Battery B, shift on. This decision weights ammo, priority of fires, and the day's scheduled planned missions don't evaporate because a battery angered you. Good chiefs restrain victory disease. If the radar is quiet and the FO reports chaos in the lane, you end. Those saved rounds belong to the infantry in an hour. Those saved seconds belong to the next battery that announces itself. This chain breaks in predictable places. If survey was sloppy, all the precision turns to drift and anger. If met is stale, range solutions breathe hot and cold. If wire is undisciplined, the net drowns in chatter and the FDC's decisions lag. If the radar is sighted badly, low-angle arcs hide and you chase ghosts. The cure is rehearsal. Night drills with empty pits and full checklists. Radios that speak in numbers until numbers feel like prayer. Map exercises where the FO learns to love the word negative because it saves time. Chiefs of FDC who turn neat draws into a combat multiplier. Radar crews who erase more than they announce until confidence means something. 90 seconds is not a boast. It is a human machine polished by boredom and fear. The boredom builds reflex. the fear sharpens it. The enemy believes he's living on your old schedule. He isn't. He lives on the clock you carry in your pocket, the one you wound the night before with survey posts and met balloons and pencils sharpened to hexagonal needles. When the chain works, it feels inevitable. That's how you know it's good. Inevitability is the sensation of 100 small choices, made correctly and quickly, converging on a single point of earth that will not be a battery much longer. You can film this as heroism. The truth is better. It's administration at speed. Hedgerows look like walls. They are actually archives. Every branch holds the memory of shrapnel. Every ditch remembers the weight of a field gun turned at a bad angle because the lane was too narrow for pride. In Normandy's bocage, counter-battery wasn't a duel across open ground. It was an argument conducted through tunnels of green. A German Nebelwerfer battery takes position before dawn because habit is a blanket. Nebelwerfers were terror machines, 6-barreled rocket launchers that turned sound into a weapon. Their physics made them loud to radar big cross-sections, bright plumes, coarse arcs that climbed like ladders. Their doctrine made them brief, short salvos, quick displacement, a roving insult to any unit that grew too confident in quiet. The battery commander has 2 gifts and 1 curse. The gifts: concealment and roads that don't look like roads. The curse: the rocket's signature. He deploys his launchers behind thick hedges, angles them through pre-cut gaps that look like the work of ambitious rabbits, and reconfirms the route to the next site with a driver who has memorized the protruding stones. He expects correctly that American eyes will struggle. He expects incorrectly that American electrons will too. On the US side, the radar crew is half in love with Nebelwerfers because rockets make friendly plots. First salvo. 6 returns stare, step up the scope. The operator marks, and the FDC doesn't even need the FO's bearing to guess which battery is howling. Nebelwerfer arcs are not artillery's thin letters. They are block print. The first grid goes out fast. Battery A is already laid on the likely Werfer lanes because the night's intel said the Germans had been playing the organ in this parish for 3 evenings running. The German salvo takes 8 seconds to speak. The US reply needs 65 to answer. That used to be enough for the Werfer crew to run like sinners. Today, the FDC has pre-registered both the initial site and the next obvious site. An orchard edge protected by a double hedge and a bend in the lane. Why obvious? Because launch angles and hedge gaps limit options, because prime mover width and ditch mud punish improvisation, because shoot and scoot is still subject to geometry. Battery A's first mission lands on the initial site with quick fuses to airburst just over the hedgerow and shower pits. The Werfer crew learns an old lesson. Hedges help against eyes but do nothing against steel from above. Splinters herd men toward the lane they meant to take. Battery B, holding a TOT computed in the night and now adjusted by 10 meters based on the radar's refined origin, lays on the bend. The TOT meets the trucks at the bend's moment of indecision, back up or go forward, turning choice into panic. The prime mover that lives longest is the one that stalls off the track and into a ditch and refuses to be dignified about it. The FO can't see launchers. He can see smoke smearing through leaves and men as silhouettes where leaves are missing. He calls quick corrections, left 50, add 50, and the FDC allows one repeat before ending the mission. Why so strict? Ammunition is not infinite, and the goal is to end effects, not keep smashing where the problem used to be. The radar's silence after the second salvo, the Werfer battery's attempt to fire a token as it limbers becomes the end state. No further arcs, no further problem. The after-action log shows the discipline of the kill. Detection, 7 seconds to first useful return, 14 to course grid. Decision, 11 seconds to assign Battery A, 6 seconds to pre-alert Battery B for likely transit grid. Execution, 65 seconds to first splash, 79 seconds to tot at the bend. Expenditure, 28 rounds he quick, airburst, 12 rounds he delay lane bend, 4 rounds smoke for obscuration during egress. Effect: 2 launchers destroyed, 1 damaged, 2 prime movers disabled, 1 ammunition truck burned. Those numbers are bloodless on paper and loud in the ditches. The Werfer crew leaves behind tubes that look like flowers knocked sideways. They also leave behind fear, which will travel faster than any truck. We fired and were answered before we could become invisible again. Speed was their god. Someone stole the altar. The hedgerow complicates radar with clutter. Yes, but clutter is a pattern, and patterns can be learned. This sector's crew has mapped which hedges, at which ranges produce which lies. They site their set at a small rise, a field hump that lifts the lobe just enough to see over the first 2 rows of green and catch arcs rising. They tune gain until leaves become whispers and rockets become sentences. They grade each track, and the FDC treats Bravo as good enough for Werfers. You don't need surgical accuracy to ruin a battery that breathes smoke. German countermeasures appear within days. Crews fire single rockets as decoys from a secondary gap. They practice false displacement by sending trucks without launchers down lanes that invite shelling. The radar doesn't care about trucks that haven't thrown a mass into the sky. It marks arcs, not lies. The FDC learns to ignore tracks that don't repeat into families. Single children trajectories seldom deserve a battalion's attention. What saves lives on both sides is routine. The Werfer crew that rehearses a real blindside displacement with pre-laid planks across ditches survives to shout again. The US radar crew that keeps grading its own confidence avoids expensive mistakes on fog mornings. The FDC that respects ammo constraints and refuses to gorge on a dying target keeps shells for the infantry at noon. Everyone has a clock. Not everyone deserves it. In bocage, edges rule. The edge of a hedge, the edge of a lane, the edge of a time window during which rockets can be both terrifying and stupid. Counter-battery in hedgerow country is a dance along edges. The unit that knows where the edges are and who can push the other man over them first writes the history of the field. The field is small, the history is large, the lesson is larger. When the sky becomes a ledger, hedgerows can't hide your balance. The numbers come due in seconds. The Hurtgenwald is a cathedral of trees that hates artillery. Trunks break patterns, branches make their own shrapnel, and the floor is a damp argument against traction. What hedgerows did with hedges, Hurtgen does with wood and then some. Ground clutter becomes a religion here. Radar crews learn humility at the edge of every pine. December presses sound flat. It carries differently at night, bounces off frozen ruts like a rumor. German batteries in this sector are veterans. They've read the Americans' new clock and learned to drag their tubes down logging tracks that exist only because men with axes were angry a century ago. They set up behind folds that aren't on maps and lay on lanes that don't look like lanes until the shell leaves the tube and writes the truth. On a morning that never quite becomes day, a 10.5 centimeters battery opens with 3 rounds. The radar set coughs literally. The generator hates cold and the scope lights in stuttering modesty. Returns, smear. Tree lines mimic arcs at low elevation. A branch-heavy stand to the west throws false hope into the operator's eyes. It's a bad track day. Bad doesn't mean useless. The operator marks and erases more than he marks and calls. He grades his own doubt out loud. Charlie confidence unless second return behaves. And the talker transmits the grid with that humility attached. The FDC accepts imperfection. It cross-checks with sound ranging, which, in this forest, is not nostalgic. Microphones do well under canopies because trees mute echoes that otherwise confuse timing. The triangle lands within 200 meters of the radar's best guess. 2 imperfect senses sing the same tired hymn. That's enough. The FO has no view of guns. He has a view of consequences. Sudden leaf storms when rounds leave the trees, and the ugly blossom of tree bursts when returning steel misjudges height. He calls a bearing on the flash he glimpses, then calls the more valuable negative on a second suspected lane. No activity east. Narrowing the search saves shells. The FDC chooses delayed fuses. Nobody who respects trees chooses quick unless the point is to make anti-personnel snow. The first volley walks in at the forest edge with delay to bite trunks and drop whole crowns into positions. That's the psychology of Hurtgen tree bursts ruin men not just with steel, but with the weight of their roof. A second volley adds smoke to blind displacement. Roads that are a meter wider than the prime movers are less forgiving when white walls appear where air used to be. The German counter-battery response is practiced and not stupid. A second section, planned for exactly this, opens from 350 meters north. Radar catches both arcs, though the second is a whisper. The FDC splits the mission. Battery A continues to club the original lane. Battery B throws a tight tot at the second with a smaller ammo spend to test whether it's a decoy. It isn't. The FO hears the echo of shells through wood and calls, "Continue." The radar reports, "Tracks ceased on lane 1. Result: the original battery falls silent. The newcomer survives but quits, which as doctrine counts as success. Killing fire also means killing nerve. Now the bulge. The front convulses. German counter-battery grows bold under the umbrella of offensive surprise. Radar sets retreat, then creep back forward behind new lines. The clock still works, but it ticks with frostbite. The Met section's profiles change hourly. Inversion layers play tricks with both sound and radio. Crews relearn. The FDC recalibrates. The FO's patience becomes a weapon. A night mission teaches new respect for refraction. The radar plots an origin that looks wrong by a field length. The FDC pauses, not frozen, just cautious, and asks sound ranging for a fast triangle. The triangle disagrees with the scope by degrees, not miles. Meteorology suggests a refractive bend consistent with the discrepancy. The chief chooses a compromise grid and orders a smaller first salvo. The FO reports airbursts short of trunks, always bad news. The chief corrects with the Met section's updated table. The second salvo bites where it should. Speed is precious. So is the permission to doubt. German crews deploy March batteries, guns that fire 1 or 2 harassing rounds while moving with columns to slow American advance and to bait radar into spending ammo on ghosts. The set doesn't listen to vehicles, it listens to arcs. The FDC, recognizing the pattern isolated single children trajectories with no family, declines to commit more than a 2-gun harassing reply unless the FO reports real effect. Restraint is a counter-battery weapon. You do not bankrupt your clock on theatrics. The forest punishes complacency. A brilliant radar solve means little if the battery's own survey is sloppy after a hasty displacement to stay ahead of a push. One afternoon, a battalion's guns pound a plot that should have hurt it does not. A line chief tramps through snow to re-verify a base stake and discovers survey drift born of fatigue, a tape misread at night by men whose hands shook. They reset. The next mission lands. Lesson written in cold. You can't buy time by skipping the steps that create it. Through Hurtgen into the bulge, the 90-second kill chain bends, cracks, and is mended. The enemy adapts with counter-battery that looks, at times, like American doctrine wearing a different uniform. Quicker replies, better use of tree cover, more deception. The difference lives in integration. American radar, sound, FO, survey, Met, and FDC speak to each other as if they've been married for years and learn to argue quietly. Germans often have excellence in pieces. The pieces don't always dine together. By January, the forest recedes, the air clears, and returns sharpen like new razors. The set drinks clean signals and hands the FDC grids that feel like gifts. But the crews keep the Hurtgen habits. Grade confidence, cross-check senses, respect the Met, and accept that speed with humility beats speed with swagger when trees turn sky into a lyre. Hurtgen and the bulge didn't make radar invincible. They made the units literate in its limits. That literacy is the difference between gadget and weapon. Machines don't deploy themselves. Discipline doesn't reproduce without a factory of habit. The story of radar-enabled counter-battery isn't a single clever set humming in a meadow. It's the logistics of turning clever into common and common into culture. Start with quantity. A handful of radar sections can change a sector. Dozens can change an army's reflexes. Field armies learned to budget sets the way they budgeted artillery battalions, densities per kilometre of front, reserves for offensive thrusts, spares for attrition that didn't ask permission. Production lines met tables of organisation and equipment. Allocation became strategy. A set missighted is a waste. A set unfielded is a crime. Quantity is sterile without uptime. A dead generator makes philosophy. Field units treated uptime like ammunition tracked in percentages, demanded in reports, punished when it sagged. Spare parts travelled forward with the same priority as fuse keys. The best formations measured mean time to repair like a quiet religion. If a transformer fails at 2, when is the scope bright again? The right answer is, before dawn. Anything else is a letter to a widow signed by logistics. Production also means people. Operators are not born. They are drilled into existence. Training pipelines taught physics without pretending to be universities. What returns are real? What is clutter's personality? How do you sit a set so? The lobe issues useful invitations to arcs. Graduates carried not just knowledge but habits. Crib sheets laminated against weather. Confidence codes standardized. A reflex to say negative when doubt exceeded tolerance. Each habit is a spare part you install in a human. The FDC had its factory too. Schools of fire direction produced chiefs who could do tables in their heads when the board fell in mud. They learned to love drawers with pre-computed data mice on place because chaos steals minutes and neatness buys them back. They learned to read radar plots with skepticism and gratitude in the same breath. The product was not a diploma. It was a mind that remains calm when a plot arrives ugly. Industry's larger role, the part audiences forget, is compatibility. The radar's connectors fit the battalion's wire. The battalion's power expectations match the generator's moods. Survey instruments share language with maps printed in faraway cities. The Met section's reports arrive in formats the FDC can digest without translators. Compatibility is expensive early and cheap later. Armies that invest up front save seconds forever. Maintenance is culture. In good units, a set never goes down without a ritual. Immediate fault isolation, pull and replace, backfill from a roving spare, and a report to a hire that knows which truck to divert to fill the gap. The truck has a spare transformer because someone in procurement gathered failure data and told a factory what to ship more of. Data becomes steel the long way around. Throughput matters. US logistics had the indecent luxury of moving heavy kits, fast trucks, railheads, depots that functioned as if boredom were a weapon. Radar sets are not light. They eat fuel. They carry temperamental guts that don't like rain and love dry tents. An army that can bring them forward and keep them fed makes electrons a routine, not an exception. Routine is the parent of dominance. Production is also disposal, knowing when a set is not worth resuscitation and having a pipeline that replaces it before the net feels the loss. Heroic maintenance on a hopeless chassis absorbs hours you can't buy back. Commanders who measure war by sentiment keep dead machines on life support. The ones who measure by effect pull the plug and route a spare, then send the carcass rearward for cannibalization. Mercy is for people. How many sets per division? Enough that a single lucky fragment won't blind a sector. Enough that a planned offensive can be thick with detection at the nose and still cover flanks. Enough that a rotation cycle exists, one set in maintenance while its siblings work, so crews don't die at their posts from fatigue more than from shrapnel. Density is doctrine in disguise. Education scales, too. After-action digests circulate not as gossip, but as engineering change orders for behavior. Tree lines at X range produce false arcs, adjust gain by Y. Hedgerow returns mimic mortar at low angles. Favor confidence, bravo, require sound, ranging confirmation. The schoolhouse updates its slides. The field updates its reflexes. This feedback loop makes an army smarter as it becomes more tired. That is how you outlast clever opponents. You learn faster than they can exploit yesterday's you. Industry supplies munitions that match doctrine. If counter-battery needs quick and delay fuses in adult proportions, the factories must oblige. If TOT packages prove decisive, ammunition trains must deliver sequencing reliability rounds that behave like their tables say. An artillery math genius is a man with a useless head if his fuse stock is wrong by the truckload. Finally, production is morale. Units that know their sets will be replaced, that uptime is valued, that spare parts are a phone call, not a fairy tale. Fight like professionals facing solvable problems. Units that live on cannibalized hope fight like gamblers. Radar turns shells into coordinates. Industry turns coordinates into a habit that makes enemies relocate their faith. This chapter has no romance. It has trucks, crates, checklists, and men who accept that boredom is lethal if not structured. But this is where the advantage really lived. Not in a secret box, but in the machinery that ensured the box was everywhere it needed to be, awake when dawn came, and loved by people trained to argue with it until truth shook out. You don't win because you're brilliant once. You win because you're competent every day. There is a genre of war story that treats invention like a cape. The gadget arrives and villains fall. The field is less sentimental. The radar set is a fine violin. Without an orchestra, it is a lonely squeal. Integration is the art of making strengths overlap and weaknesses cancel. Put brutally, any single sensor will lie to you on a bad day. A chorus, properly conducted, lies less and recovers faster. Start with the cycle. Detect, decide, deliver, diagnose, adapt. Radar primarily lives in detect, the FDC in decide, guns in deliver, the FO straddles all four with human sense, and survey divided by MET make sure the geometry and air don't sabotage the last two. After-action review diagnosis feeds next dawn's behavior. If any leg refuses to talk to its neighbors, the loop yaws, and speed dies. Radar plus sound. Why both? Because the sky sometimes lies to radio and is brutally honest with sound, and vice versa. Sound ranging performs in forests and fog, where radar chokes on clutter. Radar excels on flats where sound rolls forever and confuses itself with echoes. Use both and you get a Venn diagram of confidence. The FDC arranges missions by the overlap, not by the loudest voice. Radar plus FO. The FO is not a camera for the radar, he's a conscience. He says, negative, when eagerness outpaces evidence, and observe, when a small spend might convert doubt into confidence. He also provides narrative context movement, smoke, unusual patterns that no scope can invent. This keeps the FDC from spending ammo on mathematically plausible fictions. Survey plus MET. These two are boring on purpose. They cut the variance the others must fight. Tight survey means the FDC's exquisite plot does not die on a sloppy map. Accurate MET means the solution ages gracefully across a morning as the air warms. These departments don't kill batteries, they remove excuses. Integration honors them by scheduling them like fire missions, balloons launched on time, stakes reset after displacement, whether anyone is awake enough to love them or not. FDC plus process. The FDC is a culture. Its diction on the net is austere. Its draws a theology. It knows when to run a standard mission and when to assemble a tot trap. Crucially, it knows when to stop, when victory disease tells a crew to repeat, for pride rather than effect. Integration installs humility as a throttle. When radar goes quiet and the FO sees men running, end it. Save rounds for needs not yet born. Wire plus redundancy. Integration hates single points of failure. Redundant lines, alternate routes, radio as a tertiary layer. This is not extravagance. It's oxygen. A cut primary becomes a shrug, not a panic. Units rehearse switching to alternates in the dark because panic is slow. Integration also means interfaces the language and timing by which subsystems touch. Confidence codes standardized across battalions, grid formats that don't change with whim. Shot and splash used correctly, not as colorful promises. Interfaces reduce cognition. Reduced cognition releases seconds. Seconds are the money everyone fights over. What about invention? It matters, but only if it slots into the orchestra. A new display that cleans clutter is nothing if it demands a new power standard the generator can't provide, or a training syllabus no school teaches. A better fuse that requires a different wrench is a future truck stuck in a ditch. Integration disciplines invention. It says, not yet, to good ideas that would derail the clock. The enemy integrates too in their way. German counter-battery learns to time harassment rounds to coincide with their own assaults, so American nets are busy when decisive replies would be most useful. The answer is integration at the schedule level. Reserve a slice of capacity for counter-battery during major operations. Don't let planned fires swallow the entire day. The FDC becomes not just a calculator, but a traffic controller. Integration punishes ego. Radar operators who think they are sorcerers spend ammo on ghosts. FOs who believe only eyes count starve good plots. Chiefs who worship their boards ignore MET. Gunners who love their own rate of fire ruin TOT. The integrated unit survives personalities by turning them into roles. Do your part, then shut up and let the neighbor do his. Above all, integration breeds predictability within the unit and unpredictability for the enemy. Inside, everyone knows what a counter-battery call sounds like, how grids move, when to expect TOT sequences. Outside, the enemy cannot forecast whether reply will be single-battery hammer or two-battery trap, whether smoke will blind the lane or delay fuses will cave parapets. Predictable interfaces create unpredictable effects. If invention were enough, we would decorate factories and call it a war. The field decorates routines. That's how a circular scope becomes a clock that others must live by. Steel isn't the only thing that lands. So do ideas. Radar changes enemy schedules. It also changes enemy hearts. The shell's arc doesn't only tell the FDC a grid, it tells the gun crew a truth. You are seen in a way you cannot not be seen. German diaries, stripped of bravado, red like weather, sudden storms of fear, quick calms, then hard freezes. The first shock is temporal. Counter-battery that arrives immediately is a different creature from counter-battery that arrives soon. Immediate means your drills are no longer drills. They are choices with consequences measured in seconds. The gun captain who once shouted commands with theatrical assurance learns to count in his head how long since the first round left, and to make decisions that should have been rehearsed now merely reacted to. Reaction degrades craft. Morale erodes at decision points. Example: after the second salvo, doctrine says displace. The phone barks that hire wants another mission, it always does. Do you stay and be useful and maybe die, or move and be safe and maybe useless? Radar compresses that dilemma into a heartbeat. Repeated, it shapes a unit's identity. Cautious batteries that survive but influence less. Bold batteries that burn out. A few that thread the needle and become stories told by men with scars. Noise changes meaning. The Americans' shot, splash, once sounded like far-off weather. Now shot is the start of a countdown in the German pit, how many seconds until the trapdoor opens above us. The synchronization of American TOTs creates a sensory cruelty. Silence, then everything at once. Men are bad at everything at once. They flinch and then freeze. Freezing wastes seconds, which invites more steel, which deepens the freeze. This is how a clock becomes a weapon inside a skull. Radar also robs crews of their faith in their own camouflage. A net is security theatre when the threat listens to arcs. Once a crew internalizes that their act of firing is the betrayal, confidence in all other tricks falls. They throw effort at decoys that no scope heeds. They adjust camouflage like penance for a sin the priest doesn't care about. Effort misallocated is exhaustion earned. Discipline becomes fragile. Under constant immediate reply, great crews skip small steps. The small steps were the thing that made them great. Checking trail spades, confirming fuse settings, tightening lashing on the limber. Miss one. and a wheel snaps a kingpin during displacement, and a prime mover sits like a prayer in the lane. A radar plot doesn't have to kill to win, it can hurry. Hurrying generates its own wreckage. For Americans, the psychology reverses. The radar crew that sees its plot produce silence learns a dangerous confidence. Good chiefs inoculate against this with ritual humility, confidence codes, cross-checks, and routined debriefs, where operators are praised for erasures as much as for calls. Pride is punished quietly. A needless mission called on a Charlie. Confidence plot earns a dry remark, and an extra drill, not applause. The message: our speed is earned, not granted. The FO's morale is complicated. He hears track and feels the unit's pulse rise. Sometimes he can't see what the scope sees. He has to say negative. Saying negative repeatedly can feel like cowardice until the debrief hangs a medal on restraint. Your negatives kept shells for men who needed them. Your negatives saved time. Valor, redefined as omission, is a hard lesson. Units that learn it get faster. Units that don't waste their day telling themselves brave stories on the net. The infantry downstream of artillery sense the clock even if they don't know its math. A company that notices German batteries falling silent mid-mission walks straighter. They're not gods. The psychology of support is simple. Trust that the higher noises care. Radar gives the battalion a way to prove that caring looks like fast violence. There is also the ethics of tempo. Immediate reply in populated areas multiplies collateral risk if discipline lags. Good units write rules that bind their clock. Confidence thresholds for missions near civilians. Faux visual confirmations required in certain grids. Time of day restrictions unless under imminent threat. These are frictions added on purpose, the moral flywheel, to keep speed from becoming a vice. Radar offers power. Doctrine decides what power is for. Interrogations post-capture reveal the most human effect: superstition. Some German crews invent myths to live with the new fear. The Americans have spies in our lines. They can see in the dark everywhere. The aircraft overhead guide their shells. The truth that their own shells betray them feels too unfair to embrace. Superstition is a dignity-preserving reaction to machine logic. The antidote is not to laugh at it. It's to recognize it as a sign that the clock has colonized the enemy's imagination. Finally, the psychology returns home. Wars end. Clocks keep ticking. Radar operators carry quiet pride and equally quiet ghosts. Calls that were wrong and cost. Cautions that were right and saved. Days when bad weather made honest men blind and they had to say, "We can't," into a net that hates those words. Good commanders honor the human in the math. Rotations, sleep, warmth, hot food that isn't a rumor. Machines don't burn out. People do. The arc of a shell is physics. The arc of morale is culture. Counter-battery radar bent both. It taught one side to live inside a new second and dared the other to ask whether bravery divorced from tempo is just poetry with funerals. Counter-battery is chess at stopwatch speed. The moment radar shortened the American timeline, German batteries tried to bend it back. First move. Rapid displacement upgraded from doctrine to religion. Tubes sat limbered, ramps down, trails barely dug. Salvos shrank 2, maybe 3 then. Engines coughed and the lanes swallowed taillights. It worked when mud, traffic, or terror didn't veto physics. The US response was preemption, not pursuit. Pre-register, likely egress nodes, lane bends, culvert mouths, gate gaps, and keep a tot package on each. The first, US volley crushed pits. The second met prime movers mid-decision. Mobility became a funnel, not a shield. Second move, decoy flashes and false pits. Powder pans spat light from empty holes. The radar didn't look. It listened to mass, in motion. When deception evolved, single rockets fired from secondary hedges to simulate families of fire. The FDC treated solitude as a tell. 1 trajectory is a rumor, 3 make a surname. Ammunition was reserved for families. Third, split battery fires. Two sections at offset positions diluted a single reply. Radar returned the favor. Two origin solutions. Two missions. The FDC prioritized anatomy. Strike the ammo stack and switchboard at Site A first, then prime movers at Site B. A gun without ammunition is an exhibit. A gun without movement is a tomb. Fourth, terrain masking. Guns curled into folds and timber where low-angle tracks hid below the radar horizon. The counter was cartographic ruthlessness, sight sets on humps and spurs that lift the lobe. Thread sound, ranging baselines through the same woods to catch what radio can't. When returns were thin, confidence codes throttled spend. Humility saved shells for windows that truly opened. Fifth, time camouflage. Fire at odd hours, stagger patterns, braid missions with friendly barrages to drown signatures. The reply wasn't louder, it was scheduled. Hold back a slice of capacity during major operations, pre-brief counter, battery crews on quiet window hunts, and teach nets to treat surprise as routine. Discipline makes spontaneity legal. Sixth, counter radar fires. Spot where the set must sit. Saturate that grid after your salvo. The cure was depth and redundancy, two sites leapfrogging, alternate power, dummy masts, and a standing policy. If the set draws attention, guns repay with smoke and silence, then shift. Radar is not sacred. Survival is. Seventh, communications, sabotage. Cut Allied wire, jam nets, force chatter. US lines learned to be hydras. Cut one. Another spoke. Nets learned to be monosyllabic. Jam static into a dictionary, and numbers still fit between the noise. Finally, doctrine drift. German batteries shortened missions until firepower starved intention. The Americans let that happen. Radar didn't just kill tubes. It taxed decisions until effectiveness died of anemia. The end state wasn't always flaming wreckage. Often it was silence that arrived too soon to help infantry. In war, denial is a victory you can measure with a watch. Countermeasures never restored yesterday's clock. They taught both sides a shared lesson. Process beats tricks. Tricks exhaust. Process scales. Honesty keeps weapons sharp. Radar had blind spots you could drive a gun through if you knew when. Weather first. Heavy rain fattened clutter. Snow softened returns into polite lies. Inversions bent radio like a funhouse mirror, shifting apparent origin by a field. Good units didn't curse. They graded Alpha when clean, Bravo in clutter, Charlie when the sky wore a mask and spent ammo accordingly. Doubt wasn't cowardice. It was economy. Terrain next. Low sights lost low-angled tracks behind folds. Forests sang counterfeit arcs. Hedgerows at specific ranges imitated mortar signatures. The fix was sighting, higher by meters, not fantasies, sound-ranging overlays, and patient operators who erased more than they announced until patterns separated themselves from coincidence. Ballistics variants intruded. Barrel wear, cold propellant, lot differences, each nudged curves. That's not radar's failure, it's reality's hobby. FDCs carried day of corrections, annotated tables with pencil truth, and treated pretty math like a suspect until shells proved it innocent. Time latency is physics. Even instant plots cost seconds. If the enemy's second salvo is the last, and displacement is rehearsed, you can be right and still be late. The answer wasn't magic. It was pre-computation and pre-registration solutions waiting in drawers, not being born on the net. Bandwidth human, not electromagnetic. Nets saturate. FDCs juggle planned fires, emergencies, and the appetite of 3 regiments. Radar can feed faster than a unit can eat. Priorities, not pride, decide. Commanders enforced counter-battery quotas during offensives, so steel for infantry didn't vanish into duels of ego. False confidence is the deadliest limitation. A glowing scope intoxicates. Overcalling Charlie plots wastes ammo and creates phantom lessons. Radar doesn't work. The cure is cultural. Confidence codes with teeth, debriefs that praise restraint, and leaders who love correct negatives as much as dramatic shots. Ethical boundaries matter. Towns, farms, columns of prisoners' speed increases risk if rules are vague. Good practice bound velocity with ROE flywheels, extra confirmation near civilians, TO visual required inside certain grids, higher approval for TOT where collateral was non-trivial. The clock is a weapon. It needs a conscience. Finally, the myth problem. Enemies invented magic. Friends believed it. Radar is neither. It is a sense with habits. Treat it as omniscient and you'll die surprised. Treat it as a teammate and you'll make surprise a habit the enemy dreads. Limits didn't weaken the tool. They gave it borders. Inside those borders lay an empire of seconds. Outside them lay humility and tomorrow's improvements. At some point, the battlefield stopped being a place and became a system. Radar didn't arrive as a miracle. It arrived as a habit of measuring faster than fear, deciding faster than pride, and firing before the enemy's old truths finished their sentences. The near after, armies institutionalized the lesson. Purpose-built counter-mortar and counter-battery radars replaced adapted sets. Displays learned to love small, fast targets. Software ousted grease pencils but kept their austerity. Plot, fit, grade, fire. Sound ranging didn't die. It married radar and produced a child named Fusion. Survey got lighter. Met grew clever. The orchestra kept the violin and added sections. Doctrines rewrote themselves in verbs. Pre-register, pre-compute, preempt. Wire diagrams became traffic plans. FDCs turned from clever rooms to factories of tempo. Training pipelines taught humility as a drill. Confidence codes. ROE breaks. Hands that erase with pride. The cliché died that technology wins wars. The surviving truth, integration wins hours, and wars are made of hours. For those on the wrong side of this clock, memory hardened into folklore. The Americans had eyes in the sky. Close enough, the sky had curves. The Americans read them. More important, they organized so that reading mattered. The long after, civilian life inherited the reflex. Industries learned to prefer fast measurement plus adequate action over perfect measurement late. Emergency rooms, air traffic, logistics everywhere, a radar-shaped habit. Decide while the window is still open. Ethics followed, 2 rules that restrain speed when speed risks innocence, and the human after. Operators carried a quiet ledger, plots that saved friends, plots that didn't. The day a storm made honest men blind and they said, "We can't," on a net wired to hate that phrase. Gunners remembered the serenity of a good TOT, the way silence became geometry, and then became mercy for infantry pinned under arrogant guns. Adversaries remembered mornings when their shells betrayed them, and nights when moving fast felt like faith. If there's a moral, it isn't technological, it's temporal. Wars reward those who own seconds, who hoard them with survey and met, invest them with pre-computation, and spend them with discipline. Radar was a mint that printed seconds. The FDC was a bank that lent them with judgment. The guns were accountants who settled debts in steel. One more image to end where we began. A circular screen. A dot appears. A hand marks. Steady. Somewhere, a gun that believes it is hidden speaks. The arc it throws is a sentence with a subject and a place. The place has a name now. The name becomes a grid. The grid becomes a mission. The mission becomes silence. The day the guns learned their own address, the clock decided the war.